expressed various opinions on whether the area of strategic communications, particularly in terrorism, is an area where it is appropriate or productive for the United States government to be involved. And I think it is most appropriate for us to hear your views about whether we should be involved, how we're doing, and suggestions you have for the way forward. So I understand Mr. Langevin and other members are on the way, but in the interest of time, let me go ahead, and I'm going to turn to our witnesses to summarize their opening statements. Without objection, your complete written statement will be made part of the record. And I'll turn to our witnesses, Ms. Rosa Brooks, professor at Georgetown University Law Center, Dr. Christopher Paul from the RAND Corporation, and Dr. Tawfiq Hamid, Senior Fellow and Chair for the Study of Islamic Radicalism at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. So, Ms. Brooks, we'll start with you again. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now I can be heard. It's great to have an opportunity to be here. And let me just start by saying, as you said, I'm a professor at Georgetown. Until a few weeks ago, I was an official at the Defense Department, where I worked very extensively on strategic communication and information operations issues. But I should emphasize that although I'm very happy to talk to the extent that I can about those issues, if there's interest and questions, I am here today just in my individual capacity. I believe Chris...
Would you pull the microphone just a little closer to you? It may be me, but...
Is this better? I think Chris is going to talk a little bit about the origin of the term strategic communication and some various meanings it might have in some detail. So I won't do much beyond saying that it's a bit of a corporate import. And indeed, people often use the term strategic communications with an S on it just to mean the plural of all the different kinds of public relations, marketing, advertising. We've really struggled to give it a meaning at the Defense Department that adds some value that isn't the same, because I don't think it's particularly useful in the government context to have that term. It's just redundant if it means the same thing as public affairs plus public diplomacy plus what we used to call PSYOP and now call MISO, Military Information Support Operations. So we've really struggled to make it a somewhat more robust concept, one that emphasizes the importance of engagement, listening, understanding the perceptions of others, and aligning all of our tools, our actions as well as our words, in order to influence perceptions in a way that's in our favor. I think, though, that sort of corporate history of communications often creates a lot of misleading and overly simplistic impressions about what strategic communication can't do in the government context. One of those impressions is that it's simple. It's like selling a soda. You ought to be able to easily show success or failure. You ought to be easily able to quantify it. But in the context of national security and foreign policy objectives, it's not a soda. It's much more complex. People's bundles of cultural assumptions are very, very different. The time frame for success is much, much longer. You're not talking about increasing sales over year one or year two. It's much harder to gauge what you're doing, and it's much more of an art than a science. I think that one example, a phrase that you still very, very often hear repeated is the famous one of Richard Holbrooke's, how can the world's greatest communication society be out-communicated by a guy in a cave? And I think that embeds some of those assumptions that the skills of Madison Avenue and Hollywood in a sort of cultural vacuum can nonetheless significantly change the perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors of many, many people around the globe. Osama bin Laden, who of course was the man in the cave who Holbrooke was referring to, had a lot of advantages early on in a certain way when it came to strategic communication. One of them was the home court advantage. Compared to us, he knew the language, the culture, the history, the narrative, certainly far more than we did. They say all politics is local, maybe all strategic communication is fundamentally local, at least to be successful. He also had the underdog status, and I think we early on made a mistake in really playing into his hands in some way, giving him a prestige. Look at the appearance that the whole U.S. military was preoccupied with this one man. We had a platform already. We unintentionally raised it a little bit higher for him by seeming obsessed with one man, one organization at the expense of other issues. That said, Osama bin Laden in the end, I think, didn't out-communicate anybody. By the time of his death, he had really sunk into much greater irrelevance. I think he was overtaken by the events of the Arab Spring, a multiplicity of other voices. In a way, he forgot that actions speak louder than words and that no amount of ringing appeals to Islamic unity or jihad could make up for the number of dead Muslim bodies in the streets and the squares in the Arab world and elsewhere. He was overtaken by many other voices that in many ways were rejecting extremism. What does all this mean for the United States? Very, very briefly. I think there are some things when it comes to strategic communication that we need more of and some things that we need less of. One thing that we need more of still is we're still in the process of reforming some of our internal structures in the government to diminish confusion about just what it is we're talking about when we say strategic communication or I/O or these various other terms. We need to increase our coordination, training, etc. We need to decentralize more and stop fixating on control of the message, which rarely works. And indeed, I think one of the reasons that we've seen, in the Arab Spring, a multiplicity of voices who aren't that interested in the issues that we were interested in the end, become much more influential than our efforts to change the conversation ourselves. We need more funding for good old-fashioned public diplomacy, cultural exchanges, educational exchanges. They make a difference. They help with that decentralization by empowering those many other voices. There's some risk in that. You sometimes empower people you're not going to like very much, but I think it's one of those tactical risk for strategic gain situations. In the long term, it pays off. And we need more funding for linguistic training, regional area studies training. What do we need less of? We need a little bit less of seeing all strategic communication through a counterterrorism lens. I think that that ends up doing us a disservice in our counterterrorism aims, ironically, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that. I think we need a little bit less of an obsession with metrics and assessments. It's very hard, in fact, especially in the short run, to evaluate the success of strategic communication campaigns. I think we need less of a zero-defect mentality. No question in my mind, there are people in the name of U.S. government strategic communications doing stupid things right this minute. It's going to happen, but we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater when it does happen. And finally, just a last point, I think that we need a little bit less obsession with who does what. One of the topics that in some ways I get most frustrated by is why is DOD doing this when the State Department should be doing this in a different world. It seems to me that if the phrase whole of government that we toss around a lot means anything at all, it's got to mean that when something is in the national interest, the government finds a way to do it. In a better world, I think State Department would be better funded, have greater capacity. We're not there yet. In the meantime, I think very clearly it is, among other things, a military mission to use the tools it has to prevent conflicts when possible. I'll stop there. I know I've only skated over the surface, but I've used up my 5 minutes. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to talk more on the questions.
Thank you. We're a little liberal on the 5 minutes because I do realize this is a big topic, and we're asking you to summarize your statement. But I appreciate you doing so, Dr. Paul.
Thanks very much for inviting me here to testify today. It was, in fact, in 2001 that Vince Vitto coined the phrase strategic communication for use in the government as we were talking about it today, while serving as the chairman of the Defense Science Board Task Force on Managed Information Dissemination. So here we are 10 years later, still using his phrase, but still struggling collectively to get our arms around the concept, let alone to do it well. So there's no official government-wide definition of strategic communication, and in academia there is not an agreed definition, nor is there complete consensus about the boundaries of the concept or agreement on priorities for moving it forward. In my research, I've observed at least 3 differences, real, actual tensions in how people conceive strategic communication. These are, first, a tension between broadcast and engagement. Second, disagreement over the desired degree of control of the message, a tension between balancing taped message automatons versus loose cannon in the ship of communication. And third, a tension between inform and influence. And I think it's this latter tension that is the most significant and pernicious, a tension between those who admit that the goal of strategic communication is influence and those who hold that the goal is just to inform without influencing. And I think this is a false dichotomy. Informing without influencing isn't possible. There's no such thing, in my view, as value-free information. Every provision of information depends on the attitudes and beliefs of the speaker and seeks to serve some purpose. Letting the facts speak for themselves presupposes first 2 things. First, that the facts have something to say, and second, that they're something that the speaker once said. Every provision of information is an act of persuasion. Perhaps a more appropriate distinction to make would be between influence and manipulation. In my view, strategic communication should be unashamedly about virtuous persuasion, but should be completely devoid of falsehood, partial truths, and spin. A wide range of definitions could successfully cover the concept, as long as they respect what I call the unassailable core of strategic communication, which has 4 tenets. First, informing, influencing, and persuading is important. Second, effectively informing, influencing, and persuading requires clear objectives. Third, coordination and deconfliction are necessary to avoid information fratricide. And fourth, actions communicate. Now, this last point is particularly important, as far too often strategic communication efforts focus only on the traditional communicators and the traditional messaging to the exclusion of the messages and signals we send in other ways. So if a definition of strategic communication doesn't embrace those 4 points, then in my view, it's actually a definition of something else. I have a vision of what successful U.S. government strategic communication would look like. In this vision, we have clearly stated national objectives, which contain nested subordinate objectives, which contain nested intermediate objectives, nesting all the way down to the operational or the tactical level. These clear statements make it easy to see where there's a way and a way for influence and persuasion to contribute and where there isn't. In this vision, commanders and decision makers have a communication mindedness. They consider the messages and signals that will be sent by their actions, their utterances, their plans, policies. Failing that, or as that's developing, these same commanders or decision makers have access to and respect for communication specialists who advise them and sit at their right hand and bring the communication implications of their intentions to their attention. In this vision, everyone in government speaks not with one voice like a robot or a parrot, but with their messages aligned in the same direction, because everyone understands the nested objectives and, most importantly, how their own efforts contribute to those objectives, and because they have or have access to the requisite communication training and cultural knowledge. In this vision, communication isn't exclusively one-way broadcast, but also includes two-way communication, engagement, and dialogue. In my vision, this leads to policies shaped with our own interests, as well as the interests and preferences of others in mind. This is my vision. To support my vision, I have 6 recommendations. I'll give you the headline for each and refer you to my written testimony for the details. My recommendations: first, specify information end states. Second, build strategic communication following a crawl, walk, run progression. Third, build strategic communication from the bottom up as well as from the top down. We do need further leadership and guidance in this area from the highest levels, but better training and better practices at intermediate and lower levels can make important contributions that should not be overlooked. Fifth, make a distinction and separate virtuous persuasion from more pernicious deception and manipulation. And sixth, and finally, create and disseminate a government-wide definition of strategic communication. I'm happy to elaborate on anything I've touched on during questions and answers. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Dr. Hamid?
Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you today. I will address first an important issue with the strategic communication, which is the need and the vital need for this topic in the war on terror, because the war on terror should not be seen as a war within a geographical border. We have seen terrorism developing from Afghanistan, Pakistan, to homegrown terrorism in America here. So I see that the war on terror should focus on what I call brainistan, the impulse of hatred that's created in the mind of some individuals and causes them to do terrorism. So if we ignore this part of the problem, then we will have major difficulty really to defeat terrorism at the end. The other point I would like to mention is that after September the 11th, there were several setbacks in the relationship between the U.S. and the Muslim world. And in response to this, the United States tried several ways to improve its image in the Muslim, what they call winning hearts and minds. They used some phrases like Islam is the religion of peace, for example, so to satisfy the Muslim society. They avoided using certain expressions like the word jihad in official communications for the same reason. And they also tried in some situation to show what I call culture over-sensitivity, not just sensitivity, by having some U.S. diplomats wearing the hijab, for example, the Islamic scarf when they visit Muslim countries, or sometimes the military personnel, female military personnel, wore the hijab in Afghanistan to satisfy the local community, thinking that this will improve the image of the United States. The outcome of many of these attempts were not really very significant improvement in the image of the United States in the Muslim world. I mentioned some reports in my statement to show that the outcome was not really so very promising of all these attempts. Weaknesses in the U.S. approach, as I see them, include the following: failure to achieve what I call a critical balance, or crucial balance between showing respect to the Muslim world and not being perceived as weak. So the balance here is needed. For example, doing certain acts like the U.S. president, for example, bowing to the king of Saudi Arabia to show respect. He could have given him a hug, because bowing here can show sign of weakness that can impede the image of the improvement of the image of the United States. In general, the Muslim world prefer to have a strong friend rather than a weak friend. The other point is failure to remove the obstacles that impede the process of improving the U.S. image. Like, for example, failure to weaken the radical, or inability to weaken radical Islamic ideology itself, which is a main obstacle to improving the image of the United States in the Muslim world. The ideology itself here is crucial. Without weakening it, the image of the United States will have always difficulty to be improved. And also failure to dissociate the U.S. government from the U.S. media in the mind of many in the Muslim world. In our parts of the world, we don't see the government here separate from the media. So the government can do great things to improve its image. Yet we see someone in the media criticizing Islam, for example. This can ruin the whole image of the government. I believe sufficient effort should be given to dissociate the U.S. government from the media in the mind of many in the Muslim world. The recommendations in general, I give the outlines. We should work at 3 levels. The level of improving the message quality itself via the text. Sometimes use some Islamic text to really improve the strategic communications. I give some example here. There is a need to use certain cognitive psychology tactics to improve the U.S. image, to create positive link to the U.S. Also, the U.S. need to work on weakening the ideology of terrorism via properly calculated and adjusted psychological warfare operations. This is much more effective than just military confrontation. We need to balance this psychological warfare that's fundamental to weaken the mind of the terrorists. And finally, addressing the perception issues. So whenever certain acts or deeds or statements are released, they should be carefully done or stated in a way to avoid being perceived as weak on the other side. So you can still show respect it's great to show respect, however, you should do it in a way without being perceived as weak. These are just the frames of recommendations, and I mentioned more details in my statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me. Let me just ask each of you to comment on something I want to read, and then I'll yield to Ranking Member Mr. Langevin. This is a quote from an article entitled "Ending Al-Qaeda," which appeared in the July-August issue of the American Interest. And it says, the center of gravity in our struggle with Islamist terrorism concerns Al-Qaeda's legitimacy in the context of Muslim perceptions of the West. Counter-narratives can enable Western and allied Middle Eastern governments to convince potential Al-Qaeda recruits that violent extremism is both intellectually corrupt and politically counterproductive. If we combine these messages with a concerted effort to contest Al-Qaeda's strategic communications mastery of the Internet, we can end recruitment. We can thus destroy al-Qaeda as a self-regenerating worldwide proselytizing organization. Alas, we are not doing this very well. In some respects, we're not doing it at all. We need to change our ways lest we come to regret an opportunity missed. I'd be very interested to know y'all's reaction to those statements. Ms. Brooks?
I think it's both true and untrue. I think we are contesting the Internet, probably not as effectively as we could and should be, but I think I won't go into detail because you're probably already familiar with some of the Defense Department's efforts as well as the efforts of other parts of the U.S. government. But it's certainly an area that's getting a tremendous amount of attention, and we care about very deeply. The other part I would squabble with, I think, a little bit. We're not always the right ones to do it, and this goes back to the issue of who has the home court advantage, who has the right skill sets. We often don't get it right because we don't have the linguistic skills, we don't have the historical knowledge, and I think that there's a little bit of a holy grail fantasy of if we could only come up with this mystical alternative narrative that somehow everyone will just say, oh goodness me, extremism's a terrible idea. I think that's dangerously simplistic. There is no holy grail alternative narrative that we will put out there, and that the minute potential extremist recruits see or read, they'll go, oh gosh, I see the error of my ways. It's so much more complicated than that, and I think we barely understand the relationship between ideas, ideology, action, behavior, that identity, group loyalties, family loyalties, all sorts of things can trump ideas. That said, I think that what we do need to do, and this goes back to a point I think that we've all made in various ways, is empower other credible voices to make those arguments in a multiplicity of different ways, some of which we won't like, but which in sum total, and they'll be contradictory, it will be messy, but in sum total is often much more powerful in the Internet domain as well as every other domain than a controlled message to find the alternative narrative that we put out there. And I think this is in some ways the positive and negative lessons for us of the Arab Spring, that you pull the protesters into Tahrir Square and everywhere and elsewhere in the Arab world. They're not that interested in the United States. That's not what was getting them out there in the public squares. That was not what was motivating them. They weren't that interested in extremism either. They were there for economic reasons. They were there for political reasons. They were there because they wanted futures and jobs and better educational opportunities, you name it. And in some ways, the best thing we could do is stand back, enable them to speak, and shut up, other than saying, we support you. So I think that getting over the notion that there is some quick fix that we, the United States government, will find is something that we need to do, and put more energy into empowering and enable others to speak, recognizing that sometimes we won't like what they have to say.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Paul.
I think the quote you read represents a laudable sentiment, but I think the devil is in the details. So first, I'd like to reiterate that strategic communication is good for things other than just countering violent extremism. There's a whole host of foreign populations with whom we need to sustain positive relationships, and that it's a lot easier to prevent violent extremism before it starts by having a positive relationship and having started a dialogue long before something like that emerges. Second, this is harder than it seems. As Rosa indicated, there's no silver bullet. There's a lot of cultural context and nuance. This is not a trivial undertaking that just involves getting a few right messages on the Internet, finding the right radical extremist boards, and offering counter-arguments. And third, even if we become better at that and we do more in that domain, it's very likely that an organization such as Al-Qaeda will have a residual radical hardcore that no amount of persuasion is going to work on. And so there's going to need to be, we can't talk our way out of this problem. Absolutely, the strategic communication piece is critical, both in terms of making progress, necking Al-Qaeda down to the radical hardcore, who will need to be incarcerated or eliminated, hopefully in such a way that it doesn't engender further recruits, that's framed in such a way as to be communicated as effectively as possible. Those are just a few things I wanted to observe.
Dr. Amin?
Absolutely. I agree with the point that the counter-narrative to Al-Qaeda ideology has not been developed yet, and the United States may not be in a position or may not have the capability really to develop it, because it depends on the culture, on the religious jargon. Like, for example, here in the article mentioned, it's intellectually corrupt and the terrorism and politically incoherent. This doesn't make much sense in the mind of the jihadists. What makes sense in the mind of the Muslim world is if it is un-Islamic or Islamic. They think differently. They think in terms of religion. So I believe a counter-narrative has to be created, but the U.S. may play a supportive role here, not necessarily directly be directly involved in the process of the production itself. The second part is the use of Internet is crucial in winning the war on terror. First of all, it can help the reformation efforts. I wrote recently an op-ed to show that how the worst parts of the Muslim world when it comes to terrorism, Yemen, Somalia, and Afghanistan in general, are the lowest in using the Internet, in Internet penetration. And not only that, the Internet can be used as a tool to launch a very powerful psychological warfare operation, as I mentioned, to fight here the impulse of hatred in brainstem. So psychological warfare using the Internet is a tremendous tool in our hands, but we need to develop the content that can be really effective, because what works in our mind does not necessarily mean it will work in their mind. So what we see effective and crystal clear it will work may not work at all, and may be actually doing the opposite, may produce the opposite of what we are expecting. So we need really to go forward with using the Internet effectively to launch psychological warfare. However, we need to be very careful on the message and the content of the material to be effective on the other side. So I agree really with the view of the article.
Okay, good. Thank you. Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Chairman, without objection, I'd like to read my opening statement and then go into questions, if I could. Again, thanks to our witnesses for your testimony. I found it fascinating so far. And more than 2,500 years ago, the great Chinese strategist Sun Tzu wrote, and I quote, "To fight and conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting." End quote. While these words still hold true today, America's interest abroad does not simply rely on breaking enemy resistance, but also on enabling people around the world to share in the American ideals of protecting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Since the horrible attacks of 9/11, our country has been forced to turn its focus on battles abroad to seek justice against those who murdered nearly 3,000 people. And while we have had recent victories against al-Qaeda and their supporters, including the killing of Osama bin Laden and suppressing major elements of the Taliban, much of our effort has been falsely billed in the Muslim world as a quest for vengeance. Now, some in the U.S. have fanned these flames with similar rhetoric, only sparking greater violence and outrage. It is a vital lesson for those seeking to maintain America's influence and leadership in the world community that words matter, not only for the respect and image of our nation abroad, but also our national security. Now, strategic communication must be a whole-of-government effort that employs American values of justice and liberty to strengthen ties with our friends and allies and influence or disrupt our competitors and foes. Now, these goals are becoming increasingly difficult in a world of instantaneous global communication, where messages designed for one audience can easily spill over and be confused by another. Furthermore, these audiences are not simply empty vessels. No communication takes place in a vacuum, and certainly any American engagement overseas can and will be spun and used against us. We must also be aware that we are targets of others' strategic communication efforts and must audit our own impressions and views. Take, for example, the recent quote from the People's Liberation Army Chief General Chen Bengdi, who, during Admiral Mullen's recent visit to China, noted that America should reduce its spending on defense. Now, should this statement be taken as a legitimate expression of Chinese concerns with a strong and well-funded military, or rather is it intended as ammunition for another audience in the U.S. who would seek to stop any defense efficiencies despite a massive deficit owed largely to China and declining force responsibilities in Iraq and Afghanistan? This is just one of the many challenges facing our strategic communications abroad. So with that, I just want to thank our witnesses again for your time today. Again, I've appreciated your testimony and look forward to continue to review the printed material that you've provided to us. And I appreciate the challenges that we do face. The United States obviously has a good story to tell. It is a story of strength through pluralism and diversity, justice through fairness and compassion. We must not lose the opportunities to tell the story when we're able, so that our actions abroad may be rightly interpreted as supporting the ideals upon which our Constitution was based and which we wish for all men and women around the world. With that, I'd like to just turn to a question. Last Congress, I introduced a bill to establish a quadrennial national security review that would basically take a whole of government look at our national security challenges and resources to meet these threats. My question is, how should strategic communications be synchronized with direct and indirect efforts such as humanitarian assistance operations, and will we benefit from a high-level look at these priorities and resources across the board?
Yes, we would. I think that your idea of a quadrennial national security review is a very good one. I personally would also love to see us move towards a more unified national security budget, because I think that the increasingly archaic distinctions that we draw between what the State Department does, what the Defense Department does, which made sense in an era of rather different, more state-oriented threats, don't make much sense any longer, and yet our committee processes here on the Hill, the way our executive branch is structured, and certainly the way we present our budgets just sort of calcifies arbitrary lines that really are doing us a disservice. And I think that any effort, I think we're still obviously very far away from that, but any efforts to force the executive branch as well as invite people here on the Hill and in the media to think of these as a unified set of problems, not as over here you've got state, over here you've got AID, over here you've got the Defense Department, would be very valuable. I think that one of the tough institutional challenges that we faced at the Defense Department, and that I think is faced at every other executive branch agency, has been sort of wresting strategic communication away from the communications experts, which is not to say that that's not extremely important, but your point about how do we better synchronize it with humanitarian assistance and other issues really goes to at the point that I made and that Chris also emphasized, that strategic communication to be effective is about aligning all of the tools at our disposal, our actions as well as our words, and humanitarian assistance, among other things, can be a vital strategic communication tool. If we stick it off in a closet with public affairs, we don't tend to realize those synergies at all. So I think that's partly just a bureaucratic and structural challenge for us, and some of the internal reforms that, while I was at the Defense Department, we worked on were very much geared at how do you integrate strategic communication thinking across the department so that it's not deemed as, it's on the sort of theory of every Marine is a rifleman, everyone should be a strategic communicator and be thinking about those issues. But it's very hard to do.
So a really excellent question, because it attacks two critical issues in this area: resources and this issue of synchronization of actions. So the question is very much mindful of the fact that actions communicate. I'll echo Rosa. Yes, more resources are necessary for this. When USIA was disestablished, we lost as a nation a lot of capability in this area. Some of it was rolled into state, some of it was just lost. We've been building some capabilities in these areas, and I understand this is a time of fiscal austerity, and if public diplomacy and strategic communication are national priorities, and they should be, they need to be resourced like they are. Now, turning to the coordination and synchronization issue, that's a real challenge. Something inside individual departments that can help is the development of communication mindedness. If the people who are doing humanitarian aid, who are doing other kinds of policy, have become conditioned to ask the question, what are the communication implications of what I'm about to do, and who else might I need to coordinate with, that'll go a long way. But at the end of the day, if there are different departments that have different portfolios, it's easy to say the phrase whole of government. It's very difficult to actually do whole of government integration. part of the challenge there is within the executive departments, it's almost impossible for one executive department to have anything approaching authority over another executive department. The way it's structured just doesn't allow that. So you've definitely hit on the challenge. There are some possible solutions that can be achieved collaboratively and through training and through constant reminders of decision makers and reminders to decision makers and commanders that actions communicate and that these things need to be coordinated and integrated. But that's a real challenge and remains a challenge.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thanks for the question. I see two parts, so my answer will be in two parts. The first is when we have limited resources, I believe it's the time when we should focus on how to improve the efficacy and efficiency of using these resources. So it's not just the amount of resources. I believe what's more important is how to improve the same resources, or even less resources, to be more efficient. Regarding the synchronization of the strategic communications and the humanitarian efforts, this is absolutely needed. In cognitive psychology models, in memory, in human memory, there is a concept called, or a theory called the spreading activation model. That means that when you remember something like the word red, you remember apple or red car or blood, some related information. All information are like a network of related data. So when you remember in the Muslim world, for example, the word USA, it can be either linked to positive or negative things. Now it's more linked to negative things. That's why the image is not that good. The aim of using humanitarian aid here can play significant role in changing this link to make it positive. I'll give you an example that happened in our country, Egypt, in my country, my original country, Egypt, that in the 80s, after Yom Kippur War, after a long period of hatred to America during Nasser time, the United States USAID used to send some chickens directly to the hands of people, and the color of the cover of the bag was, or the color of the bag, there was something like the US flag. It was not the flag, but with same colors. It represented America. We called it the American chickens. And what happened when Egyptians used to eat these chickens? Believe me, this was happening. We used to pray, say, God bless America. The taste was so good, and it created a link in the human brain between the word USA and the good taste. So it was a positive link toward USA. And during that time, the image of US was marvelous. So synchronizing the humanitarian aid with strategic communication, they should work together, because you can use the humanitarian aid more effectively when you, for example, add the image of the flag, and you can put the two flags of the two countries so that it's not misunderstood in a negative way. So it creates a link toward the flag of the USA via using humanitarian aid more effectively. So I fully agree with this point. I called this chicken diplomacy, by the way.
Thank you all for your answers. I yield back.
Mr. West?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and thanks to the panel for being here. And Dr. Hamid, I absolutely applaud you for your stance and your efforts. I spent 22 years in the military, and as an artillery officer, one of the things that we saw develop was the understanding that you have lethal fires, but then you also have this thing called non-lethal fires. And when you do your strategic studies, they will teach you that there are 4 elements of a nation's power, and that's the DIME theory: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. So I think one of the things that we have not really been able to do a good job of is really understand how do we leverage the non-lethal fires, the information operations, as part of our national power. And I think that when you look at the fact that we continue to talk about a war on terror, and I think you will agree with me, terror is a tactic. And so a nation cannot really fight against a tactic. That's something down at the tactical level. So I think we have missed the boat as far as our strategic communications. And until we can clearly understand and identify who the enemy is and their goals and objectives, then we're not going to be successful in bringing together a targeted strategic type of communications message, which, as you just said, should not be in the realm of communicators. It should be in the realm of operators, and I think that's an important thing. So my question to you all is this. Do you think in developing a strategic communications plan, and we've been at this for 10 years now, that we have truly failed to understand the impetus behind which our enemy combats against us? And also, I would ask the second question, do you think we are narrowly defining our enemy? Because if Al-Qaeda was to change their name tomorrow, does that mean that we have won?
That's a good question. I think that, as you said yourself in your comments, terrorism is a tactic. It's not an entity called terror. It's a method. It's an asymmetrical method of warfare, and those with less power will at times turn to it. And that there's important in being very precise about who we're talking about when we talk about the war on terror. So to the question of do we understand the impetus behind our enemies, I think it depends, well, which ones. The Taliban is different from Al-Qaeda. Al-Shabaab is different from main Al-Qaeda. Hamas and Hezbollah are very, very different from Al-Qaeda. And I do think that we do ourselves a tremendous disservice when we lump them all together. They may have elements in common, may draw on similar modes of support, may have similar ideological elements, but they're not the same. The grievances, the issues that motivate their adherents are fundamentally different. And I think that one of the, again, efforts that we've really certainly worked on, I know during my time in the Defense Department, and I think that the U.S. in general has made some significant progress, is in disaggregating. And saying, you can't fight if you don't understand who you're fighting against, and we do ourselves a real disservice if we don't disaggregate. If you will indulge me, one other metaphor I wish we could put to rest is the war of ideas metaphor, which again I think, as with the war on terror, tends to confuse us more than it actually enlightens us. As we've said earlier, there's no one meta-narrative that magically ends extremism or ends terrorism. We don't really understand the relationship between ideas and action. There are lots of people who are exposed to and maybe adherents of violent extremist ideas, but who don't become terrorists, don't fight against us. To paraphrase the NRA bumper sticker, ideas don't kill people, people do. And we need to understand that I think at times the fixation on extremist ideology can really blind us to that sort of down and dirty work of really disaggregating and saying what is going on in this country, in this province, with this demographic group that is motivating them to take action against us, so that we can tailor our responses accordingly.
I think the way you framed your question provides a really important frame, the separation between fires, lethal fires, and non-lethal fires. In the military, we really understand how to do lethal fires. There's a protocol, there's a target, there's a desired effect, there's a variety of different munitions that might deliver that effect. We know and we understand that. Not so much on the non-lethal fires side, on the information operations side. It's harder to define the target. It's hard to know what the desired effect really is. It's harder to articulate that, and it's harder to measure that. So bringing that up to strategic communication, you asked about strategic communication strategies and strategic communication plans. I think on some level it would be best if we didn't have a strategic communication plan, but just had a plan that included strategic communication. One of the recommendations I make, and if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'll elaborate, is that we should elaborate information end states. This is a piece of advice that comes from Professor Dennis Murphy at the U.S. Army War College. And it's one of the best pieces of strategic communication advice I've heard, so I try to repeat it whenever I have the chance. Dennis Murphy says, hey, we should change the guidance for the commander's intent such that commander's intent be required to include an information end state. So if the traditional commander's intent, to give a simple example, is remove, or if the desired end state is remove the insurgent presence from village X, if an information end state is required, the commander might also make clear, remove the insurgent presence from village X whilst retaining the attitude of non-combatants as neutral or better towards the friendly force. With that caveat, with that extra information end state, now subordinates have a lot more clear guidance to execute on. And if they don't feel comfortable with the different approaches necessary to do that, then they know they need to reach outside their own stovepipe and go find someone who has that expertise. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Regarding the first question, have we failed in our strategic communications or information warfare? My answer is yes, we certainly have failed. Until today, terrorists are generated in a high rate. We have homegrown terrorism here in the United States in the last couple of years that exceeded previous 8 years since September the 11th. So certainly the evidence is showing that we are not so very successful on this front. The other question, have we failed in defining the enemy? My answer is certainly yes. We failed basically to define the word radical. We are fighting like radical Islam sometimes, and we say we support moderates. But when you ask people, how would you define radical and how would you define moderate? What are the parameters? It's like a doctor going to do a surgery for cancer without defining the criteria for cancer. We failed to understand the relationship between the ideology and the actions. So we simply focused on, like a doctor focusing on the abscess and ignoring the diabetes that caused the abscess. You treat the abscess, you have another abscess. You treat it again, you have another abscess. Until you recognize the underlying cause and the mechanism, diabetes, obesity, aggravating it, you see it, the holistic picture, then you cannot cure the condition. And I see we ignored the common factor in all the groups, whatever you call them, whatever their names are, they share one thing, a common ideology that tells them to kill the other, or not to be tolerant to the other, or to hate the other. And as long as we do not confront this ideology effectively and weaken it via education, via psychological warfare operations, via other means, we will not be able really to really control this problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for being here. I appreciate your talking about the whole of government approach because, for years that was very frustrating because you could really see why we needed to do that, and yet it was clear that we weren't quite there. But I wonder if you could, is there an example, a positive example of where that whole of government across entities and with proper communication occurred and could be looked at as, and actually we would have even the results of what that might have changed in terms of, can we look to any of that? What do we learn from that, or what do we learn from the fact that we can't find an example like that?
I have one. Unfortunately, it isn't a U.S. one, but the Australian Royal Assistance Mission Solomon Islands, RAMSI. They went in there, it's a peace enforcement and governance restoration mission, I think in the 2005-2006 timeframe. And they had amazing whole of government integration. How did they do it? They had the 3 commanders on the ground, the representative of their foreign ministry, their State Department, the police representative they sent, and the military representative. The 3 of them went around joined at the hip. If ever they spoke in public, one was at the podium, the other 2 were sat behind him or her. If a question came up that required an answer that they hadn't already reached a consensus on, they'd turn around and put their heads together and get the Royal Assistance Mission Solomon Islands answer. And so they always had integration. That may not always be practical, but there's one example of success.
Were they approaching that were they understanding that within the context of strategic communication, or they were doing that, perhaps they would say because it was the right thing to do, but because they needed to try and carry out a mission that required, I'm thinking of, the African command, maybe command is even the wrong word, in AFRICOM, but where we've tried to put people forward who don't only represent the military, the Pentagon. And
they didn't use the phrase strategic communication. They did it in the name of unity of command, which is an important strategic communication principle, and they were very mindful of the message their force and their actions were sending. Within the separate command stovepipes, within the military stovepipe, within their civilian police forces, they were very cognizant of how their behaviors, how their dress, what kind of messages those sent to the civilian population, and that it was very important to them to be internally consistent and not be contradictory. So while they might not have used the phrase strategic communication. I would argue that what they were doing was very much in that vein and with that intention, a whole of government continuity and coherence.
I think it partly depends on the scale. I think it's easier to find good examples on a very small scale than on a very large scale, just because the nature of this is a big government, this is a big country, it's a big world. The bigger the issue,
Right.
you can say here are areas where we did better or worse, but it's very tough to say here's a unequivocal, wholehearted success. I can think of a couple of examples of things that I think that we got better or got right. I can think of more, but I'll just mention a couple. One, which was a very difficult issue where I think we certainly got better, was in the context of civilian casualties in Afghanistan, where there was a very conscious shift, which was very much a whole of government shift from saying our first reaction to press reports or other reports of civilian casualties caused by coalition forces is going to be to say, we don't know what you're talking about, we're going to do an investigation, they were all bad guys anyway, what do you mean? To a shift to saying, straight off the bat, everybody saying, if our actions cause civilian casualties, we will do everything we can to correct it. We are so sorry if there has been any loss of innocent life. Nothing we can say can change the fact that people have lost loved ones. We know that. I think that shift in itself was actually quite significant and took a real conscious effort to sound less defensive, to say, loss of life is loss of life. It doesn't matter if it was justified, that grieving parents or relatives are still grieving. I think that was getting it better in reaction to learning the hard way that we were getting it wrong. Another more recent example of one, I think all things considered, the government did a pretty good job, was the death of Osama bin Laden. I think that we fumbled a little bit on the details of what happened in terms of how the story came out, but I think it was actually handled in precisely the right way across the government, which was supposed to say, this is something we've been trying to do for a long time. We said we were going to do it. We did it. This guy's a bad guy. He's not here anymore. Good thing. But also without turning it into a moment of exulting in vengefulness or exulting in death or lionizing him more than inadvertently raising again the prestige and the profile of Al-Qaeda, that it was the right degree of bad guy, he's dead, we got him, we can do these things. But also sort of saying, and you know what, he's not that important anymore. Move on.
Yeah.
I actually was going to give the bin Laden example also as a matter of cooperation, but I don't really have several other examples really in my mind about this sort of cooperation. I see from the other side that actions of the US government seems to be dissociated from one another. One part of the government is doing something, another part is doing something else. Sometimes it's beneficial because if someone did mistake, the other one can try to correct it, but in general things must be synchronized more effectively together, I believe. So.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, may I just ask one quick question, because I know we don't have too many of us here. I was really interested in your comments, Dr. Hamid, about weakness, respect and weakness.
Yes.
And I particularly related to the hijab, the U.S. women going in and wearing the hijab, and also thinking about how those of us the women who go in, also cover our heads. We don't maybe wear the full, but we're told to do that, and we do that out of respect.
Yeah. But
where is help me with this weakness and respect, and where does one go for that information?
Yeah. The other side simply sees it as you are subjugated to Islam. The word Islam means submission. It was supposed to be submission to God, but it's used politically after the death in different ways to submit others to the values of the religion. You see, the radicals everywhere are trying to submit other people to their will. In Somalia, from Afghanistan, the Taliban, even in the Salafis in Egypt recently were trying to submit others. So they see you as submitted to their value system. So you see, they are bowing to us. This is how they will interpret it. We are winning. We are victorious. So whatever you do, on one hand, to really show victory and bring a psychology of defeat in the mind of the enemy, the enemy will always go and say, look, they are defeated, they are bowing to us, they are following our values. So this is how it is seen as weakness. That's why what I am saying is to show respect. Yes, absolutely. But to be very careful of doing this without showing signs of weakness. So you can still achieve the positive value of showing respect to others and without the negative effect of showing weakness. And weakness from their side, from their point of view, not from your point of view. From your point of view, you can't see it. But this is how it is seen on the other side.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And after this question, I unfortunately going to have to depart for a meeting that I have in my office. But it's important to stay, and again, I'm fascinated by the discussion here today, and I understand how important these things are and how they matter. Obviously, the conflict in terms of where we are today has been years in the making, particularly the conflict around with violent jihad.
Yeah.
How do we really turn this around? And one of the things that I struggle with, and I think we're all challenged by, is the fact that if you look at, for example, throughout the Quran, there are numerous examples where it actually calls for followers to commit violent jihad. That it calls for acts of violence to subjugate, and it's almost a duty to do that. It's not like in some cases in the Bible, as I understand it, there are certain cases where might be called for acts of violence, but they're almost subject to interpretation. It might be more vague than it is in the Quran, which seems to be very direct in calling for acts of violence. So if that's the case, how do we turn this around? How do we win, in a sense, achieve a peaceful outcome?
Thank you for this question. This vital question. And I noticed, for example, I read the Bible when I was young, and in Deuteronomy you will find, for example, fight against the Amalek, for example, specific group. So it's not a general fight for everyone else. But I'll give you a personal story of mine. One day I was praying in Egypt when I was young, beginning my real story in religions and in thinking, and I read a verse in the Quran that says, فَاقْتُلُوا الْمُشْرِكِينَ حَيْثُ وَجَدْتُمُوهُم. Kill the infidels wherever you find them. And my conscience couldn't accept it. So I asked a Salafi friend of mine, his name was Adil, he was radical, and he said to me, yes, we have to fight the infidels, and it's obligation on us. I went to a Sufi scholar, which is a mystical form of Islam. He said to me, just love every human being and be good with every human being. And this was not satisfactory. I said to him, it's written, as you mentioned in the Quran, it's written here. He said to me, يَوْمَ يَأْتِ تَأْوِيلُ, which means in the day of judgment you will understand the meaning. So for me, I was not so patient to wait for the day of judgment. I just followed the one who is giving me the literal meaning. Later on, in the reformation efforts I'm doing, I realized that all the verses in the Quran that talks about jihad or violence use the expression the before the expression infidels. Al-kafirin, al-mushrikeen. Al means the in Arabic. It's like telling you I'm going tomorrow to a White House, or I'm going tomorrow to the White House. It's completely different. Just emphasizing the value of the or al before the word infidel in the Quran can simply solve this problem. Because once you say that, you define the meaning, the violent text, to this specific group in the early stages of Islam. You can't generalize it to everyone else. So there is a way within some linguistic analysis and interpretations really to limit the meaning of the violent jihad to some specific group only in the early stages of Islam. So it's certainly possible to through different ways of interpretations, through language, to really limit, you take it literally from me, all the violent texts of jihad can be limited to the early stage of Islam without being currently applicable in our modern times. So there are ways to do it. It's not impossible. It's certainly possible.
If I can add a thought on that, I think I defer to Dr. Hamid about all of this, and I'm sure it is right that there is a segment of the population for whom that sort of textual analysis can make an enormous difference. At the same time, I think there's a real danger of placing too much emphasis on ideology. Islam's been around for 1,500 years, more or less, and the rise of extremist Islamic terrorism is a pretty new phenomenon. And even today, the vast majority of Muslims in the world want nothing to do with it. So I think assuming that our problem is this pernicious ideology that comes out of the Quran can be very misleading, and this goes back to the earlier discussion of what's the relationship between ideas and behavior. For the average recruit to extremist action, it may have far more to do with what their brother suggested that they do, or economic need, or fear, or anger about a very specific policy. Whether it's of the United States or somewhere, they may be wrong, they may be misunderstanding it, but a perception about Palestine or Israel, for instance. And I think that we would be wise to not overemphasize the role that ideology, religious or otherwise, plays in what are violent social movements that often have many complicated causes, some of which are nationalistic, some of which are economic. Not to suggest that there isn't a very important role for a segment of people in doing that, but I sometimes think that we get so obsessed with we've got to counter this ideology that we give too little attention to the other causes that motivate people to become recruit. And I know that I'm not an expert on radicalization, but I have colleagues who spend a great deal of time looking very concretely at case studies of how does person A end up being radicalized. And it's pretty rare that ideology has much to do with it, except as a kind of blanket justification that becomes convenient when someone asks. It usually has much more to do with who their friends are, who's paying them, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I'm not denying the role of other factors. There are other factors that can play a role. However, we should ask ourselves a basic question. Why the socioeconomic and political factors that some people say it makes someone a terrorist, why they do not affect, for example, the Christians in the Middle East who live under the same socioeconomic and political circumstances? Like we haven't seen the Christians in Iraq, for example, doing suicide bombing or beheading other people. So it's obviously the problem is coming from a specific group here. So if the factors, the external factors, were the true cause of the problem, it shouldn't distinguish between a Muslim or Christian or a Jew. It should affect all the population. So you see terrorism developing in any poor area, like from Brazil to India, for example. But that's not the situation. That's what makes the ideology playing a pivotal role. But yet, I'm not saying it is the only role. There are other contributing factors.
It's complicated, and I won't pretend to have the answer. I'll make two observations. First, given that this conflict was years in the making and did take a long time to brew, we should accept that it may well be years in the unmaking. And second, that the kinds of things that will help are kinds of things we're talking about: promoting engagement, encouraging shared understanding, trying to identify and emphasize shared values, share information, and better understanding of radicalization processes, and connecting engagement and promotion of shared understanding in programs to try to diminish radicalization processes.
Very good. Thank you all for your testimony today. It's been invaluable. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Ms. Brooks, y'all were really talking about this, but and I acknowledge that there's no one factor that makes one go blow yourself up. But certainly during the Cold War, we fought an ideological struggle as well as had troops in Europe and nuclear weapons, and so it was a multi-front sort of effort to combat the evil, I will say, that was coming out of the Soviet Union. So isn't there an ideological aspect to the fight against those who want to come kill innocent people in the name of religion also?
Absolutely, and I don't mean to suggest that there is no ideological aspect. I think I would just emphasize what you just said. It's got to be a multi-front battle, and I think that where we err, I think, when we get a little overly simplistic and start thinking it's a magic bullet. If we could only refute the ideology, if we could only come up with the alternate narrative, that's when we start getting ourselves into trouble. It's a component. The nature of the component is probably different with different groups of people. I at risk of repeating myself, I think it's sort of disaggregate, disaggregate, disaggregate.
No, and I think that's a fair point. But I guess what we're trying to evaluate, as somebody said, 10 years on into this, is to what extent the ideological part of this is appropriate for the U.S. government and how well the U.S. government is doing it. And I think at least both of you have said it's not just a counterterrorism issue. There is a strategic communications element to a whole variety of engagement with the world, and I acknowledge that. I guess we're kind of taking the terrorism as a case study here today mostly. As that passage I read indicates, at least there are some who believe that if we can be more effective, we can decrease Al-Qaeda's recruitment and, to borrow a phrase, have it wither on the vine.
Yeah. I think it's a question of balance, as ever. I mean, can we be more effective at exactly that? Should we be? Yes, absolutely. And I think that there are actually some very interesting projects, some of which you're probably aware of. For instance, the center at West Point that I can't remember the name, Center for the Study of Terrorism.
Yes, Center for Combating Terrorism.
That does these extremely interesting studies, close readings of documents released by leading Al-Qaeda figures, points out contradictions, et cetera, puts them up on the web. That one tiny little project, which is not very expensive, actually there is some clear evidence that makes a difference, that it gets them very upset, that for the segment of people for whom ideology is important, that matters. And so I don't at all mean to suggest that we shouldn't do it and that we shouldn't do it better. We absolutely can and should. I think it's just that when we overvalue the ideological component and forget to think about everything from that war via chickens humanitarian assistance piece to another piece of your question, thinking about what is it that we don't do that well but that other people can do much better. And this goes back to empowering other voices, empowering both the U.S. private sector, because there are just things that the U.S. government shouldn't do, and empowering others.
I want to get to that whole subject in a second.
Yeah.
So, but I take your point. Dr. Hamid, we had witnesses at our last hearing who suggested that one of the most effective messages, whether it's from us or from others, is the idea that these terrorist acts kill innocent Muslims. And so the fact that you have innocent members of the same religion who are being slaughtered with these acts, do you think that is effective to use?
Absolutely. Using this fact that the majority of the victims of terror are Muslims can be used effectively in strategic communications to show that the whole war against the terrorists is actually a war that protects the lives of many Muslim people. And ideally, if there is some moderate Muslims come in this whole image to support this, what the U.S. is doing against the terrorists, it's not just selfish action that only cares for the personal interests, but it's much broader than this. It's far more than just the security of America. It's security for the whole world, including many Muslim innocents. In fact, one of the best ways to achieve this is to show the Muslim world the impact of terrorism on the Muslim society. One of the very sensitive areas is the impact on women. Many of the terrorist acts in Pakistan and Afghanistan ended in orphans or widows. Some of them, for example, had to do some immoral things because of the poverty and the need. If this stories are emphasized to the Muslim world, they will really start to hate terrorism, and it can help a lot in preventing the process of radicalization. So certainly this is one of the most fundamental areas that could be used.
Okay. Dr. Paul, in your comments you said something about we need to make sure that what we do is more effective. Ms. Brooks says there's too much emphasis on metrics when we talk about strategic communications. My question is, how do you know what's effective if you don't have some way to measure the results?
Another really good question. Yeah, it's very difficult to do effective measurement in this area. When we look at industry, they're engaging in similar kinds of challenges, sharing ideas and engagement pathways, but at the end of the day, they have a sales metric. Either their product is being bought or it isn't. It's much harder to capture measures globally. That's an area we can get better at. There is something to learn from industry. There's something to learn from social science. When I speak to junior officers about things that they can do in smaller areas of responsibility, I talk about field expedient measurement. There's something to the old aphorism that the plural of anecdote is data. That if you collect impressions, patrol impressions, crowd impressions over time, and plot those kinds of events against exogenous factors, significant events in other areas of responsibility, elections, things like that, and if you can plot a trend over time, then you can see and compare that to the kinds of things you've been doing. And this is at a very small scale. There's some traction there. At the bigger scale, there's polling. It's not that we're completely ignorant of how to do measurement in this arena. There's room to get better, and of course, measurement isn't free.
Yeah. Ms. Brooks, let me go back to the private sector for just a second. One of the things that struck my attention years ago on this was someone I knew in the political consulting world went to run a campaign in a Muslim country successfully for president, and then wanted to come here and offer his services to the United States government for free. I mean, he made all the money he needed to make, but there was no way for him to plug in.
Yeah.
And in spite of knowing a lot of folks at the State Department at that time and around the administration, it was simply impossible. And so that's one of the reasons that somebody referred, I think, to the Defense Science Board study, that I thought their suggestion of having a FFRDC that's separate from the government where the private industry could plug in, and some of those skills from Madison Avenue or international political consulting could be useful. When you did your review for the administration, did that figure in at all, or is that all a pipe dream that government is government, private sector is private sector, and if you want to come work for government, you got to come be a civil servant or something?
I think on the level of principle, everybody agrees with that. That we ought to do more with the private sector. We ought to enable the private sector more effectively. I think where it breaks down is implementation, and I think it's quite shocking. I think we literally just have astonishingly few vehicles to enable private sector action, even when, as in your example, we have people literally coming to us, from very large corporations, universities, non-government, saying, how can we help? We don't know what to do with them. We don't know what to tell them. We say, thanks, we'll get back to you, and we never do because we have no vehicles for using them. That is for a lot of different reasons. Some of them are reasons of bureaucratic rigidity and the usual stupidities. It's not in any, there doesn't help anyone to do it, so they don't. It's not their job. Some of it has to do with legal and ethical restrictions that have been put there for very good reasons. If you are in the executive branch, it's actually quite astonishing when you make the mistake of asking the lawyers something like, well, could we ask Google to help us with it, or whatever the question may be. The answer is usually don't even think about it. Don't you dare, often because of legislative restrictions that are in place to prevent conflicts of interest, et cetera, et cetera. How we untangle that, I don't know, but I actually think it would be a fabulous project for folks here to undertake, would be to really do an evaluation of the both the sort of the bureaucratic reasons and the statutory reasons that is so hard, because I absolutely agree. our greatest strength as a country is not our amazingly streamlined executive branch, sadly. Our greatest strength as a country is our people and our organizations, and finding better and more effective ways to let them do what they're good at is something that strikes me as extremely urgent, and we're shockingly bad at it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Dr. Paul?
If I may, in my written testimony, there's a brief reference to the Woodrow Wilson Foundation or Institute for International Scholars SAGE initiative, Strengthening America's Global Engagement, that has taken about a dozen reports recommending reforms in public diplomacy and strategic communication, all of which advocate some kind of, like the Defense Science Board, some kind of semi-independent or independent entity. And they've been working since September of last year with a large consortium of think tanks, individuals from industry, from government, from advertising, from academia, to synthesize some of the best ideas in a no-kidding business plan for such an entity, and hope later this year in a bipartisan way to advance such a thing. If such an entity came into being, that would be the perfect opportunity for $1 a year man who wanted to come in and share expertise or provide skills to plug into that organization, making that expertise available to the government, leveraging the private sector, and getting public-private partnership benefits.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to seeing what they come up with. Now, to pass something through Congress, we have the same jurisdictional issues that you've referenced earlier, but I think there are a number of us at least who are interested in exploring that. We haven't talked about Smith-Mundt, Dr. Paul. How big an impediment is that to us being effective in our communication?
It makes a difference. Just for background, the Smith-Mundt Act is actually the Information Exchange Act of 1948, amended a couple of times. The principal complaint about it isn't that it established the foundation for public diplomacy, which it did, but some of the later amendments prohibit dissemination of information intended for foreign audiences to the domestic U.S. public. I was at a hearing for the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy earlier today. Sat next to me was Jeff Trimble, the Executive Director for the Broadcasting Board of Governors, the folks who do Voice of America and all the different voice programs. And he reported some sad instances where domestic populations, domestic radio stations, and broadcasting communities within the United States wanted to have access to BBG Somali language broadcasts or BBG Urdu language broadcasts for domestic populations, and when they made a formal request to the BBG for those broadcasts, the BBG, because of these statutory constraints, had to say no. And he also related the sad story of just recently being abroad, being in Russia, and talking to Russian administrators to try to encourage them to relax their policies regarding BBG products being disseminated in Russia. And the Russians pointed out, well, gee, you have this Smith-Mundt Act, so you can't show these broadcasts to your people. Why should we let you show them to our people? To which he had no answer. So there's a concrete example. When you talk to folks from the Department of State, they don't see it as much of a constraint. They're more inclined to, in my experience, to laugh it off as kind of a historical oddity that doesn't get in their way very much. It gets in the way at BBG, and I've heard far too often of accounts of it getting in the way at the Department of Defense as well.
Yeah. So have I. And it seems to me it's a great example of an outdated law that has not kept up with change in technology. And you think about the Internet and how Smith-Mundt can possibly apply to that situation. It makes no sense to me. And I continue to hope and think that common sense will prevail at some point. And again, we're not interested in the government providing propaganda, as it's called, to try to influence decisions within the United States. But at the same time, when you can't even communicate basic information because of this, it makes no sense at all to me either. We may have a couple more questions that we submit to y'all in writing after we go through some of what we've talked about. Again, let me thank each of you for being here and for your expertise and opinions that you've shared with us. This is as I think several of you said, it's harder than it seems. Recognize that. On the other hand, that doesn't mean we should walk away from making the attempt, because I am of the view that it is an important component, not only against the terrorists, but in a variety of aspects of U.S. foreign policy and national influence around the world, and we've got to get better at that. So thank you again for being here, and with that, the hearing stands adjourned.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.